Some owners resorted to deeper cruelty, believing terror could cauterize fear. They doubled punishments, shortened rations, tightened restraints. But these plantations suffered the most accidents: poisoned wells, broken equipment, fires that started in two places at once. Others attempted a different approach, softening routines, allowing marginal freedoms, desperately trying to bind their human property with incentives rather than whips. It was not compassion, simply calculation. If the enslaved had learned to organize, then kindness might be cheaper than fear. By the early 1720s, the colonial government was overwhelmed by reports that made no sense within their old assumptions. Slaves who should have known only the boundaries of one plantation were found with knowledge of supply routes between distant estates. Overseers who had once walked confidently through the fields now traveled armed in groups. Planters ceased gathering for their monthly councils. No man wished to sit in a room with 13 others, replicating the shape of a circle burned into the Greyfield kitchen floor. In the letters of the time, a new word began to appear, a word planters had used sparingly before: uprising. They spoke of it with the dread one might use for a sickness, something invisible, contagious, without a clear beginning or end. Rumors crossed borders faster. In Spanish Florida, communities of free black families reported the arrival of fugitives from the Carolinas, men and women who carried detailed knowledge of British plantations, including the weaknesses of specific overseers, the rotations of patrols, and the secret fears of their former masters. Some of these refugees spoke of a teacher, a woman who had shown them how to read a house not by its walls, but by its vulnerabilities. Whether she was Espiranza or not mattered less than the effect. Resistance was becoming systematic. By the late 1730s, this change flowered into open revolt. The Stono Rebellion, the largest slave uprising in colonial America, erupted along the same rivers that had once fed Greyfield's wealth. Many of the rebellion's leaders had worked on plantations tied to the old Rice Council network. Historians would never confirm a direct line between Espiranza's vengeance and the uprising, but the echoes were undeniable. A reliance on intelligence, the exploitation of predictable routines, and the quiet knowledge that fear could be wielded as effectively as chains. The centuries that followed blurred the boundaries between fact and folklore. Stories of Espiranza traveled on the tongues of enslaved parents to their children, that she had walked across water, that she had become smoke, that she had killed a council of men using nothing but her voice. These were not literal tales, they were emotional truths, stories meant to keep hope alive in the darkest hours. What mattered was the lesson they carried: that even the most entrenched cruelty carries within it the seeds of its undoing, and that those who call other people property should fear what property remembers. By 1766, the sealed records in Charleston were opened exactly as Governor Johnson had ordered. But by then, the world had changed. Revolution was in the air. The colonies themselves were questioning the authority of old masters. The revelations contained in the Greyfield documents were overshadowed by larger upheavals. But for those who read them closely, a chilling truth emerged. The system had cracked long before the American Revolution had begun. It had cracked on a night when a kitchen furnace burned too brightly, and a woman sharpened knives while humming a lullaby from a homeland long aflame. Greyfield's kitchen did not survive the decades. No slave would work there. No overseer could enter without trembling. The building weakened, boards rotted, and the place where 14 men died under the heat of their own arrogance was demolished and left to the encroaching wilderness. But the lesson lingered in the marshes and among the people who passed beneath the oaks. Those who treat other human beings as objects do so at their own peril. Objects can think. Objects can wait. Objects can set fire to the very order that cages them. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. What do you believe still lies buried in the unturned soil of America's forgotten past? Are there truths waiting in our archives, or stories whispered in the dark, that would change how we understand the world we inherited? Share what you think, and if you want more journeys into the shadows left behind by history, subscribe, ring the bell, and join us next time as we trace the stories that were never meant to survive, yet refused to die. But the official act, sealing chapters of the event, could not erase the deeper, slower changes the kitchen had set in motion. Owners moved with new caution. Meetings waned. Guards multiplied. And throughout the plantations, an intelligence began to circulate. Small fires started in the night. Tools mislaid, then found placed where work could not continue. Words passed between kitchens like contraband. Fear had been introduced into a system that had relied upon the certainty of terror. The balance had shifted, not because law changed immediately, but because in the marrow of the colony, a new knowledge had taken root. The masters could be vulnerable, and those they called property could remember, plan, and retaliate. The fear that settled over South Carolina in the weeks after the Greyfield Massacre was not loud. It was quiet, creeping, a kind of pressure behind the ribs. The dawning realization among white planters that something fundamental had shifted. They had always assumed the enslaved feared them completely, predictably, permanently. But the sudden knowledge that a single woman, armed with patience and the tools of her captivity, had undone 14 of the colony's most powerful men, weakened the invisible scaffolding that held their world upright. The plantation houses grew strangely silent at night. Masters began locking doors they had never locked. Overlooked windows were latched, cellars checked twice, overseers ordered to carry arms even during daylight. It was not an official decree, nothing written in Charleston's records, but a collective instinct, a tightening. Fear had become part of the air. The colony moved fast to bury the truth. Governor Robert Johnson's council sealed every scrap of testimony, every description, every detail that had not already slipped into rumor. The official story would speak only of a catastrophic fire, tragic, accidental, perhaps caused by an untended hearth. The bodies had simply been too burned, they claimed, to allow certainty. Behind closed doors, however, the council acknowledged what the cover story could not. If even the outline of Espiranza's method reached other plantations, the entire colonial economy might tear at its seams. So they chose concealment over spectacle. Public execution was rejected. Too many questions, too much risk of admiration spreading among the enslaved. Instead, they arranged her sale to a Spanish trader known for supplying labor to the silver mines of South America. Those mines were death sentences written in stone. Few survived longer than 2 years. But even that had a danger. She might speak during the voyage, might teach others, might build a legend in places outside British control. And so the Spanish captain of the Santa Isabella received an unspoken instruction. She was not to reach Cartagena alive. Yet ships carry more than orders. They carry eyes and memories. A few months later, a Spanish clerk wrote in a private journal that during a supply stop in Havana, a Portuguese-speaking woman had been transferred quietly off the Isabel and onto another vessel. She was described as composed, articulate, and strangely well-informed about plantation systems in Carolina. The clerk wrote of her with something like awe, calling her a woman who talks of chains like a scholar and of justice like a prophet. But he did not record her name. Other stories surfaced as shadows, free black sailors claiming a woman had been rescued near the Bahamian channels, traders whispering of an Angolan woman who reached the Spanish territories and began teaching fugitives how to read the habits of their former owners like maps. Each tale was impossible to verify, and yet the stories persisted, spreading from settlement to settlement, plantation to plantation, until Espiranza's name became something larger than a single life. She became an idea, sharp, dangerous, and impossible to chain. What is certain is what happened in Carolina after her disappearance. The unrest began subtly. A barn fire on the Peaton plantation, a string of dead livestock on Sutton's property, a collapsed granary on Warwick's estate, the supports mysteriously weakened. Each incident alone could be misfortune. Taken together, they formed a pattern no overseer wanted to name aloud. More troubling were the whispers among enslaved people, whispers that did not stay confined to a single property. It became clear that information was traveling in ways it hadn't before, moving across waterlogged rice fields and pine barrens with unsettling speed. Slaves began speaking of overseers' habits with a precision that unsteadied their owners. The time a man walked to his office, the days he traveled to market, the routes he took to visit neighbors. It was as if the colony itself had become transparent to the eyes of those meant to remain unseen. Espiranza sat at a distance, sharpening knives with a motion as calm as tide. She spoke in a voice tuned to a tempo they recognized, but with a content that shattered their assumptions. She addressed them individually, naming cruelties she had learned in 15 years of listening. To Sutton, she recited the ways he had broken new arrivals. To Rutherford, she spoke of families sold and never reunited. To Peaton, she read from memory the ledger entries that reduced births and deaths to pounds and pence. She used language like a scalpel, precise, cold, tailored to cut where memory ached. Each recitation was a dawn-slow torture of its own. The men in the circle recognized offenses and realized at last how those offenses had felt from the underside. Then came the methodical physical cruelty, not random or vengeful, but enacted with the scientific hand they themselves had used upon others. Espiranza had stoked the furnace for hours. She had brought iron rods to glowing life and warmed them until the metal bled light. She applied them sparingly here and there, a heated rod to a hand, a touch to a cheek, a pressure that seared and provoked a scream that went nowhere because the mouths were muffled. She timed pain and paused to prolong awareness. Between contacts, she read ledger entries aloud, numbers and names becoming a liturgy of the men's own making. The kitchen filled with a new kind of sound, not the familiar crack of a whip, but the unlearned keening of masters discovering what it is to be property. Heat and humiliation did their work. As the day unwound, the furnace's radiation swelled. The room became a distorted oven where breath evaporated into the air. Espiranza would wet cloths and press them to foreheads, not to soothe but to keep the men conscious, to deny the release of sleep until the point of no return. She wielded control as they had wielded it, calibrating how much and how long another human body could endure. Hours waned, and the men changed from furious to begging, bargaining in a manner that had so often been denied to those they owned. Greyfield, older, sustained by care and money, lasted longest. His final plea was an offer of wealth, of amnesty in return for life. Espiranza's answer was a quiet pronouncement. He would die knowing that his claim to superiority was a choice, a moral failing, not a divine right. By the following dawn, the kitchen had become a ring of charred bodies, blackened shells arranged with the grim geometry of the furnace's circle. The scene was one that could not be reasoned into the colony's tidy categories. Overseers reached the house and found, instead of a simple blaze or a slave revolt foiled, an almost ritual tableau. 14 of the colony's most influential men burned into a shape that mocked their authority. Espiranza sat at the table with knives sharpened and a lullaby on her lips. When questioned, when the white men who survived and their deputies came calling, she said only what necessity required and what her heart permitted. The phrase she had repeated earlier, "Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete," traveled like heat through rumor and then into law, a sentence turned into a proverb. What followed was not merely an attempt to punish a single act. It became a political operation. The colonial government, afraid of contagion, fearful that the example of Greyfield might teach other slaves how to organize, how to use domestic access as an advantage, moved quickly to contain the story. Governor Robert Johnson convened council. The official version was made tidy: an accidental fire in the kitchen, tragic loss of life, no mention of binding, no mention of muffle, no mention of a single woman who had made herself the instrument of reckoning. The council's records were sealed. Orders were sent to Charleston that the account should not be discussed. Espiranza's fate was determined in the same pragmatic cruelty that had defined their world: to be sold to Spanish interests in the Americas, a sentence designed to be a delayed execution rather than a moment of public adjudication. Rumors, however, do not respect governors' seals. In the quarters and along supply routes, whispers grew that Espiranza had spoken of contingency plans, that she had friends among free black sailors, that perhaps she would not die quietly in a trader's ledger. By noon on June 23rd, the first of the Rice Council had arrived, dismounting beneath the Oak Avenue as if the land itself were pledged to their authority. Marcus Sutton came early, as he always did, a broad-shouldered man whose appetite for domination matched the size of his holdings. Edmund Greyfield received him with the ceremonial courtesy of men who traded in human bodies and manners with equal care. One by one the others came. William Petton with his armed retinue, James Rutherford with the magistrate's pistols at his hip, Henry Caldwell in an elaborately gilded carriage, Thomas Harrington in a posture of former naval command. Each arrival added a new note to the chorus of confidence that had informed their world for decades. At 2 o'clock, the meeting began. The men sat around an oak table imported from England, candlelight making gilt shine and conversation seem more earnest than it was. They argued rice prices and seed schedules, the technicalities of breeding, the legislative nudges they needed from Charleston and London. Between business and brandy, they traded stories about punishment and seasoning with the same clinical detachment that guided their ledgers. Espiranza moved among them like an instrument, a hand that refilled cups, a shadow that cleared plates. Her face was the same blank mask it had been for 15 years. Inside, her mind cataloged tone and timing, each hiccup of laughter and the comfort of predictable routines. She had prepared the brandy. Over weeks, she had learned which man preferred a certain decanter, how much each would drink, how their tongues would loosen as the evening deepened. The mixture she carried was not simple poison. It was precise, an herbal compound her grandmother had taught her to make, one that induced deep unconsciousness for hours while leaving the body otherwise intact. It was meant to buy the time she would need, to render predators pliant enough to be bound and transported. One by one, the effects took hold. Baxter, the young, over-enthusiastic member, slumped first, his shoulders folding as the room swam before him. Peyton complained of nausea. Rutherford's eyes would not focus. Greyfield tried to speak of suspicion, and suspicion left him before he finished the word. Within 20 minutes, the council lay unconscious around the imported table. Espiranza worked with the kind of efficiency plantation life had honed in her. Swift hands, careful knots, the patience of someone who had watched suffering for years and learned its measures. She took rope and iron shackles from the pantry, the same devices with which they had restrained slaves for generations, and placed them upon the men who had ordered so many restraints for others. She bound wrists and ankles not to break the men quickly, but to keep them conscious, to make them able to listen and see. She stuffed raw cotton into mouths so that cries, if they came, would be muffled into ragged, helpless sounds. Dragging those bodies across a house built for pomp was the work of hours. Each man was heavier than she was. Each movement required balance, timing, secrecy. She moved through corridors that smelled of polish and spent tobacco, past portraits that had never looked at a life worth less than £1 sterling. By 2 a.m, the council was arranged in the kitchen, a perfect, terrible ring around the coal furnace that Greyfield had shown off like a jewel of engineering. It stood 8 feet tall, brick and iron and imported pride. A machine that could hold a temperature pure and sustained the way some instruments hold a note. Espiranza positioned them with a geometric care, feet pointing inward, hands bound behind backs, mouths gagged, bodies a deliberate lattice of vulnerability. Dawn brought a slow, deliberate waking. The herbal compound would not kill quickly. That was not its function. It would give them hours to come to awareness, to understand, to feel worthless, and then to be taught the cost of levity. Greyfield opened his eyes first and understood. The furnace, which until that morning had been a symbol of his sophistication, now radiated a heat that felt like accusation. Around him, men tried to move and could not. The cotton muffled the first thin sounds into choking stutters. Their faces, raised with the cultured arrogance of men who had never been helpless, shrank into something new and raw. Espiranza served at their meetings for 15 years. She refilled glasses. She cleared plates. She moved like a thing that ought to be ignored. She catalogued names and habits the way a botanist catalogues species. When Peyton excused himself for bladder trouble, when Rutherford boasted about separating families as a motivational tool, when Sutton spoke of seasoning like a teacher describing curricula. To them, she was seen and unseen, a fixture in their domestic machinery. To her, every offhand comment was data, a map of vulnerabilities, of times and routes and rituals that could be turned against them. The plan that came to define everything did not begin with hatred alone. It grew from a narrower, sharper wound. In the spring of 1715, something shifted in Espiranza's life. Survival had required a coat of quietness, but beneath that coat, she had kept something else, a careful, improbable tenderness. His name was Wayne in the secret tongue. Plantation lists shortened it to Boy Tom. Born on Rutherford's land in 1693, he had survived the seasoning that broke most. He could read, a secret skill taught by a gentle overseer who would later die. He taught other slaves to read in whispers. Wame and Espiranza found each other in that forbidden space. What began as exchanged intelligence, patrol schedules, sympathetic hands, routes to Spanish Florida, deepened into a private, fiercely kept love. Their meetings were songs and gestures disguised as habit, an intelligence network grown on the roots of everyday work. By late 1715, that network extended beyond Greyfield's walls. Safe houses, sympathetic whites, contacts in Spanish Florida who could shelter escapees. They planned not a single flight, but a sweep. A coordinated uprising that could free many and sever the rice machine for a moment. Then greed intervened in a small mercantile voice. On a spring day in 1716, Greyfield announced a new breeding program, a calculated policy to breed what he called superior working stock. Espiranza's name sat at the top of his list. In a single offhand sentence, Greyfield announced a future that would make her less than human, moved to a compound, controlled and observed for conception and profit. The news arrived like a closing door. Wame would be sold to Rutherford after the council's June meeting. The window narrowed. Escape remained possible. Wame had a contact with a Spanish trader who could smuggle them to St. Augustine within a week. Yet Espiranza refused the private mercy that might save too. "Running saves us," she told him in Portuguese, "but it changes nothing for our people. These men will replace what we take with others. The cruelty remains." Her resolve hardened into something implacable. One chance to alter a system, to send a lesson through the planter class that would echo in their dreams. Over the next fortnight, they refined a plan that was part intelligence operation, part psychological warfare, and part brutal, practical mechanics. Espiranza would use the Rice Council itself, its routines, its complacency, to stage a meeting that would become final. Wame handled logistics, alibis for sympathetic servants, the movement of materials, contingency routes. She used 15 years of listening to map the rhythms of men who believed themselves gods. The meeting set for June 23, 1716, would be their last regular gathering. On the morning of June 22, Espiranza began the visible work of preparation. She inventoried the kitchen, counted chains in the pantry, noted the movement of domestic hands so that empty rooms would be in place when the council convened. She had spent months learning the coal furnace, an enormous imported structure Greyfield loved to show off. It could hold temperatures beyond ordinary fire, the sort of heat that melts copper and bends metal. She had learned how to stoke it, how to sustain its fury. She had been quietly adding coal to a nearby storage room under the pretense of expanded cooking needs. 3 days before the meeting, she received the final cruelty. Wame had been sold. His transfer was scheduled for the morning after the council. The timetable closed like a fist. That night beneath the cypress, they pressed what time remained into whispers. Wame begged her to flee. She refused. "They believe they are gods," she told him. "They must learn they are not." He accepted the steel in her voice and spent the last few hours helping place the plan's final pieces. At dawn, she began feeding the furnace according to a schedule that looked to any observer like ordinary kitchen labor. By noon, the fire reached a peak she had charted on secret nights. A furnace ready to burn for hours, hot enough to become an instrument of something the colony had never imagined. The day had begun. The men were already on their way. In the swelter of 1716, 14 of South Carolina's richest planters rode to Greyfield, expecting routine conversation, ledger disputes, and the easy laughter of men who owned whole families as property. None of them walked back out. 3 days later, officials found a scene that refused the language of chance. Charred bodies arranged in a perfect ring around a coal furnace, hands bound with iron shackles, mouths packed with raw cotton. The single living witness sat unmoved in the kitchen, a woman named Espiranza de Lima, humming a lullaby in Portuguese while she sharpened the household knives with a deliberate, almost ceremonial patience. When asked what had happened, she answered in broken English with a single sentence that would become a smoldering proverb among those who remembered. "Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete." For 2 centuries, the colonial record sat sealed by order of Governor Robert Johnson, buried beneath the weight of the city's polite papers. For 2 centuries, the story was a rumor, a warning whispered over field fires and in the hush of slave quarters. Tonight, we begin to trace what lay beneath those sealed pages. A slow, methodical vengeance that ruptured the certainty of owners across the Low Country and shifted the balance between master and property in ways the governors had not anticipated. The tale does not begin in a kitchen with a roaring furnace. It begins 15 years earlier in the port smoke and salt of Charleston, in the year 1701, when the colony's fortunes rose on the tide of rice and the cruel economy of bondage. Wealth in the Low Country fed on human labor, practiced hands in flooded paddies, calloused backs bent under the sun, lives reduced to line items in ledgers. Among the most feared names was Edmund Greyfield, a second-generation planter who had turned 3,000 acres of swamp into a private empire north of the Ashley. Greyfield was a man who prided himself on a certain efficiency of terror. Tall, pale-eyed, a presence that inspected people the way other men inspected horses. His estate, his practices, were the sort of rumors that made mothers hold infants closer when supply ships arrived, and children were marched to market. In September of that same year, the Santa Maria, a Portuguese ship, slipped into Charleston Harbor with 180 captured people from the coast of Angola. Among them was a woman of roughly 20 years who would be named by her new owner, Espiranza. To the planters inspecting bodies as one inspects cargo, she was unremarkable. Average height, competent health, a price made respectable by youth. What they did not see were the scarifications on her shoulders, the marks of a lineage they could not read, a story of rank, of a childhood taught in strategy, persuasion, and the uses of herbs and lore a colonial mind would dismiss as superstition. Espiranza had watched her village burn. She had seen Portuguese raiders take what they wanted, murder her father, scatter a people. Each white face that later crossed her path was, to her remembrance, connected to that first violence. Edmund Greyfield paid £42 and took her into a household where cruelty had been bureaucratized for profit. Greyfield kept his domestic order like he kept his books, precise, ruthless. His previous house slave had died with a bruised skull and a story that everyone knew to cover with a lie. From the moment Espiranza stepped into Greyfield's kitchen, she began a different kind of work, one whose hours were measured not in punishment and rice quotas, but in observation, memory, small experiments in patience. She learned English, though she pretended not to. She moved through the dining room and the study like a shadow, listening to men speak of people as property, learning the cadences of a confidence that came from owning the law as well as the land. Greyfield's house was more than a home. It was a council hall. The Rice Council, the informal conclave of the colony's most powerful planters, met there. 14 men, Edmund Greyfield as the de facto leader, William Peaton, the great rice producer, James Rutherford, planter and magistrate, Marcus Sutton, who trafficked in human breaking, Henry Caldwell with political sinew, Thomas Harrington, ex-naval officer and overseer of men, Benjamin Fairfax, an old fortune, Samuel Kingsley, who specialized in seasoning new arrivals, Robert Fielding, an inventor of tortures, Charles Warwick, the gossip center, Jonathan Crichton, who cataloged breeding, David Norris, a surgeon who kept bodies fit for profit, Alexander Hartwell, a jailer of runaways, and George Baxter, young, enthusiastic, and dangerous. These men shared techniques the way other men shared recipes, measures of food, strings of lashes, methods to extract the last of a person's usefulness.